History has shown that Bacon's inductive approach to science was largely ignored, and that the deductive approach of Galileo and Newton was highly influential. Contrary to what Bacon believed, productive science required bold theory and hypothesis testing. It is not bad to have hunches or even beliefs about how things are. What is bad is to not modify those hunches or beliefs if the data require it. Popper noted that important scientific discoveries never come from induction, as Bacon had believed. Bold ideas, unjustified anticipations, and speculative thought are our only means for interpreting nature, our only instrument for grasping her. The experiment is a planned action in which every step is guided by theory. Most scientists, since the time of Bacon, have rejected his extreme reliance on the method of induction, but not all. In psychology, Skinner and his followers, we'll see in chapter 13, adopted Bacon's atheoretical philosophy. And in 1950, Skinner wrote an article titled "The Theories of Learning Are Theories of Learning Necessary?" And his answer was no. In 1956, Skinner described his approach to experimentation. The approach involved trying one thing and then another, pursuing those things that showed promise and abandoning those that did not. In the Skinnerian approach to research, there is no theory, no hypothesis, no mathematical analysis, and supposedly no preconceptions. Also in the Baconian spirit, the Skinnerians believe that the main goal of science should be to improve the human condition. Bacon is a pivotal figure because of his extreme skepticism concerning all sources of knowledge, except the direct examination of nature. He urged that nature itself is the only authority in settling epistemological questions. We see in Bacon an insistence that observations be made without any philosophical, theological, or personal preconceptions. Skepticism concerning information from the past also characterized the first great philosopher of the New Age, René Descartes, with whom we turn to next. René Descartes, born of wealthy parents in Le Haye, France, René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, was truly a Renaissance man. At one time or another, he was a soldier, mathematician, philosopher, scientist, psychologist. In addition, he was a man of the world who enjoyed gambling, dancing, and adventure. But he was also an intensely private person who preferred solitude and avoided emotional attachments with people. At a time when his fame had begun to grow, he moved to Holland. And while he was there, he moved 24 times without leaving a forwarding address so that he would not be bothered. Descartes' mother died when he was barely a year old while giving birth to another son, who died 3 days later. Because his father, a wealthy lawyer, practiced law some distance from home, Descartes was reared mainly by his grandmother, a nurse, and an older brother and sister. As one might expect, Descartes was a very bright child. He was enrolled in a Jesuit school in La Felice when he was 10 years old and graduated when he was 16. While at La Felice, he, like other students at the time, studied writings of Plato, Aristotle, and early Christian philosophers. As a student, Descartes was especially fond of mathematics, and by the time he was 21, he knew essentially everything there was to be known on the subject. After his graduation from La Felice, Descartes roamed freely and sampled many of life's pleasures, finally taking up residence in Saint-Germain, a suburb of Paris. It was there that Descartes observed a group of mechanical statues, which the Queen's Fountaineers had constructed for her amusement. The statues contained a system of water pipes that, when activated by a person stepping on the hidden floor panels, caused a series of complex movements and sounds. As we will see shortly, the idea of complex movement being caused by a substance flowing through pipes was to have profound influence on Descartes' later philosophy. Descartes' search for philosophical truth. About the time Descartes moved to Saint-Germain, he experienced an intellectual crisis. It occurred to him that philosophers had been seeking truth for centuries, but had been unable to agree among themselves about anything. He concluded that nothing in philosophy was beyond doubt. This realization thrust Descartes into deep depression. He decided that he would be better off learning things for himself instead of from the experts. I resolved to seek no other knowledge than that which I might find within myself, or perhaps in a great book of nature. Like Francis Bacon before him, Descartes sought an intellectual fortress capable of withstanding assaults of skeptics. Descartes' method of self-exploration was productive almost immediately. Usually Descartes explored his many new ideas while lying in bed. During one of these meditations, he invented analytic geometry. After watching a fly in his room, Descartes noted that he could precisely describe the fly's position at any given instance with just 3 numbers. The fly's perpendicular distances from 2 walls and from the ceiling. Generalizing from this observation, Descartes showed how geometry and algebra could be integrated, making it possible to represent the astronomical phenomena such as planetary orbits with numbers. More generally, Descartes had discovered the exact correspondence between the realm of numbers and the realm of physics. However complicated, all natural events were now describable in mathematical terms. Like Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo before him, and like Newton after him, Descartes reached the conclusion that ultimate knowledge is always mathematical knowledge. With the invention of analytic geometry, it was now possible to precisely describe the measure essentially all known physical phenomena. In this way, Descartes further substantiated the Pythagorean conception of the universe that had been accepted by Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, and that was about to be elaborated further by Newton. Next, Descartes sought after other areas of human knowledge that he could understand with the same certainty as analytic geometry. Stimulated by his success in mathematics, Descartes summarized his 4 rules for attaining certainty in any area. The first rule was to never accept anything as true, unless I recognize it to be evidently as such, that is, carefully to avoid all precipitation and prejudgment, and to include nothing in my conclusions unless it presented itself so clearly and distinctly to my mind that there was no reason or occasion to doubt it. The second was to divide each of the difficulties which I encountered into as many parts as possible, and as might be required for an easier solution. The third was to think in an orderly fashion, beginning with the things which were the simplest and easiest to understand, and gradually, by degrees, reaching towards a more complex knowledge, even treating as though ordered materials were not necessarily so. The last was always to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that it would be certain that nothing was omitted. Thus begins Descartes' search for philosophical truth. He resigned himself to doubt everything that could be doubted, and to use whatever was certain, just as one would use axioms in mathematics. That is, that which was certain could be used to deduce other certainties. After a painful search, Descartes concluded that the only thing of which he could be certain was the fact that he was doubting. But doubting was thinking, and thinking necessitated a thinker. Thus, he arrived at his celebrated conclusion, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Descartes established the certainty of his own thought processes. A certainty for him, made an introspective search for knowledge valid. Innate ideas. Descartes further analyzed the content of his thoughts and found that some ideas were experienced with such certainty and distinctiveness that they needed to be accepted as true, and yet they had no counterparts in his personal experience. Descartes thought that such an idea were innate, that is, that there were natural components of mind. For example, he observed that even though he was imperfect, he still entertained ideas that were perfect, because something perfect could not come from something imperfect. Descartes concluded that he could not only have been the author of such ideas. The only hypothesis left was the idea that the idea was put in my mind by nature, and that was really more perfect than I was, which had all perfections that I could imagine, and which was, in a word, God. Descartes included among the innate ideas those of unity, infinity, perfection, and axioms of geometry and God. Because God exists, is perfect, and will not deceive humans, we can trust the information provided by our senses. However, even sensory information must be clear and distinct before it can be accepted as valid. Clear means that the information is represented clearly in consciousness, and distinct means the conscious experience cannot be doubted or divided for further analysis. Descartes gave the example for seeing a stick partially submerged in water and concluded that it is bent. Seeing the apparently bent stick provides a clear cognitive experience, but further analysis, such as removing the stick from water, would show that the experience was an illusion. Thus, Descartes concluded that the rational processes were valid and that knowledge of the physical world gained through our senses could be accepted because God would not deceive us, but that sensory information had to be analyzed rationally in order to determine its validity. Descartes' method then consisted of intuition and deduction. Intuition is the process by which an unbiased and attentive mind arrives at a clear, distinct idea. An idea whose validity cannot be doubted. Once such an idea is discovered, one can deduce from it many other valid ideas. An example would be first arriving at the idea that God exists, and then deducting that we can trust our sensory information because God would not deceive us. It is important to note that Descartes' method restored the dignity to purely subjective experience, which had been lost because of Galileo's philosophy. In fact, Descartes found that he could doubt the existence of everything physical, including his body, but could not doubt the existence of himself as a thinking being. The first principle of Descartes' philosophy were cognitive in nature and arrived at by intuition. There is also no mathematical concept any more certain than cogito ergo sum. This being so, we can turn our attention inward to the mind, self, soul, and ego, and examine the subjective experiences as thinking, willing, perceiving, feeling, and imagining. Although Descartes' philosophy was anchored in rational and phenomenological processes, he had an entirely mechanistic conception of the physical world, of all animal behavior, and of much human behavior. In his world, animals responded to the world in a way that could be explained in terms of physical principles. To understand these principles, we must recall Descartes' observation of the statues in Saint-Germain. The reflex. Descartes took the statues at Saint-Germain as his model in explaining all animal behavior, such as human behavior. That is, Descartes explained both the behavior of the statues and the behavior of animals in terms of mechanical principles. The sense receptors of the body were like pressure plates that started the water flowing through the tubes and activated the statues. Descartes thought that the nerves as hollow tubes containing delicate threads and connected our sense receptors to the brain. These threads were connected to the cavities or the ventricles of the brain, which were filled with animal spirits. The concept of animal spirits was popular in the early Greeks and Aristotle and perpetuated by the highly influential physician Galen. By believing that the presence of animal spirits distinguished the living form from non-living, these philosophers and physicians embraced a form of vitalism. Descartes described animal spirits as a gentle wind or subtle flame. The delicate threads in the nerves were ordinarily taut, but when an external event stimulated a sense organism, the threads were tightened further and opened a pore or conduit in the corresponding brain area. The pore then released animal spirits into the nerves. When the animal spirits flowed to the appropriate muscles, they caused the muscles to expand and thus caused behavior. Descartes gave us an example of a person's foot coming near a flame. The heat causes a pull on the threads connected to the cavities of the brain containing the animal spirits. The pull opens one or more of these cavities, allowing animal spirits to travel down the hollow tubes, nerves, to the foot muscles, which in turn expand and withdraw the foot from the flame. This was the first description of what is later called a reflex. That is, an environmental event automatically causes a response because of the way the organism is constructed. By saying both animal and human interactions with the environment were reflexive, Descartes made it legitimate to study non-human animals to learn more about the functioning of the human body. He did a great deal of dissecting and concluded from his research that not only could interactions with the environment be explained through mechanical principles, but so could digestion, respiration, nourishment, growth of the body, circulation of blood, and even sleeping and dreaming. In 1629, the British physiologist William Harvey, in 1578 to 1657, demonstrated that the heart was a large pump that forced blood into the arteries, then into the veins, then into the lungs, and then back into the arteries. In other words, Harvey discovered, even in Descartes' lifetime, evidence showed that his analysis of reflective behavior was incorrect. And it was fairly conclusive evidence that nerves were not hollow, and that there was good evidence that there were two distinctly different types of nerves: sensory nerves carrying information from sense receptors to the brain, and motor nerves carrying information from the brain to the muscles. It also had been commonly observed that several animals continue to move and react to certain types of stimulation even after they were decapitated, and it was common knowledge that animals could acquire new responses. Although all these observations posed problems for Descartes' analysis of reflective behavior, he never modified his position. Before long, however, others would make necessary corrections to Cartesian theory. Cartesian is the term used when referring to some aspects of Descartes' philosophy and methodology, such as the Cartesian coordinate system you learned in math class. Mind-body interaction. As mentioned, Descartes believed that all animal behavior and internal processes could be explained mechanically, as could much human behavior and many human internal processes. There was, however, an important difference between humans and other animals. Only humans possessed a mind that provided consciousness, free choice, and rationality. Furthermore, the mind was non-physical and the body physical. That is, the body occupied space, but the mind did not. In the process of arriving at the first principle of his philosophy, I think therefore I am, Descartes believed that he had discovered the fact that the mind was non-material. Descartes described what he next deduced from his first principle. I then examined closely what I was, and I saw that I could imagine, and I have no body, and that there was no world nor any place that I occupied, but that I could not imagine for a moment that I did not exist. On the contrary, from the very fact that I doubted the truth of things, it followed very evidently and very certainly that I existed. On the other hand, if I had ceased to think, while all the rest of what I had ever imagined remained true, I would have no reason to believe that I existed. Therefore I concluded that I was a substance whose whole essence or nature was only to think, and which, to exist, has no need of space, nor of any non-material thing. Thus it follows this ergo, this soul, by which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body, and is easier to know than the latter, and that even if the body were not, the soul would not cease to be all that now is. By saying that the non-physical mind could influence the physical body, Descartes confronted the ancient mind-body problem head-on. What had been implicit in his philosophies from the time of Pythagoras was explicit in Descartes' philosophy. He clearly stated that humans possess a body that operates according to the physical principles and a mind that does not, and that the two influence each other. So, on the mind-body problems, Descartes was a dualist, and the type of dualism that he subscribed to was interactionism, sometimes referred to as Cartesian dualism. The question, of course, is how this interaction occurs. Because the mind was not physical, it could not be located anywhere. Descartes believed that the mind permeated the entire body, and that the mind is not housed in the body as a captain, but that the mind is not housed in the body as a captain is housed in a ship, demonstrated by the fact that our sensory experience embellish our cognitive experience with color, for example, and by the fact that we consciously feel bodily states such as hunger, thirst, and pain. None of these experiences or feelings should be possible if the mind were not closely related to the body. Still, Descartes sought a place where the mind exerted its influence on the body. He sought a structure in the brain because the brain stored the animal spirits. Although the structure had to be unitary because our conscious experience, although often resulting from stimulation, coming from the two eyes or two ears, is unitary. Finally, the structure had to be uniquely human because humans alone possess a mind. Descartes chose the pineal gland because it was surrounded by animal spirits, what we now call cerebral spinal fluid. It was not duplicated like other brain structures, and he erroneously believed it was found only in the human brain. It was thought that the pineal gland, that the mind willed the body to act or inhibit action. When the mind willed something to happen, it stimulated the pineal gland, which in turn stimulated appropriate brain areas, causing animal spirits to flow through various muscles and thus bring about the willed behavior. Because the mind is free, it can inhibit or modify the reflexive behavior that the environment would elicit mechanically. Emotions are related to the amount of animal spirits involved in a response. The more animal spirits, the stronger the emotion. Emotions are experienced consciously as passions, such as love, wonder, hate, desire, joy, anger, and sadness. According to Descartes, the will can and should control the passions, so the virtuous conduct resulted. If, for example, anger is experienced and anger behavior is appropriate, the mind will even facilitate such a behavior. If, however, such behavior is seen as inappropriate, the mind will attempt to inhibit. In the case of intense passion, the will may be able to prevent the reflexive behavior, and the person will act irrationally. Descartes was well aware of the difficulties in explaining how non-physical mind could interact with the physical body. After several attempts to explain this interaction, he finally decided that it could not be explained logically. Rather, he supported his argument for separate but interacting mind-body entities with common sense. Everyone, he said, has both bodily and conscious experiences and senses, the fact that two influence each other. Thus, the supreme rational philosopher supported one of the most basic conceptions by appealing to everyday experience. Descartes' contributions to psychology. Descartes attempted a completely mechanistic explanation of many bodily functions and much behavior. His mechanistic analysis of reflexive behavior can be looked at as the beginning of both stimulus and response, and behavioristic psychology. He focused attention on the brain as an important mediator of behavior, and he specified the mind-body relationship with such clarity that it could be supported or refuted by others. Reactions to his notion of innate ideas were so intense that they launched a new philosophical and psychological positions, modern empiricism and modern sensationalism. By actually investigating the bodies of animals to learn more about their functioning and thus about the functioning of human bodies, he gave birth to both modern physiological and comparative psychology. By making purely subjective experience respectable again, Descartes paved the way for the scientific study of consciousness. His work on conflict did not focus on sinful versus moral behavior, but on animal versus human. Rational versus irrational behavior. He was interested in the type of conflict that Freud later studied. Finally, because of his use of introspection to find clear and distinct ideas, Descartes can be looked on as an early phenomenologist. After Descartes, some philosophers elaborated on the mechanical side of his theory by saying that humans were nothing but machines and that the concept of mind was unnecessary. Others stressed the cognitive side of his philosophy, saying that consciousness is the most important aspect of humans. In any case, what followed Descartes was, in one way or another, a reaction to him. For that reason, he is often considered the father of modern philosophy in general, and of modern psychology in particular. Controversially, concerning Descartes' religious beliefs clearly reflected the transitional period in which he lived. If one aspect at face value, what Descartes said, he undoubtedly believed in existence of God and accepted the authority of the Church, especially Descartes. However, Descartes was caught between his loyalty to his Catholic Church and his objective search for truth. Between 1629 and 1633, Descartes worked on his book, The World, which supported many of the conclusions that Galileo had reached in his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. Although Descartes believed Galileo's arguments to be valid, he decided to suppress publication of the world when he learned of Galileo's fate at the hands of the Inquisition. In a letter to his friend Martin Mersenne, Descartes said that he agreed with Galileo's views, but that I would not wish for anything in the world to maintain them against the authority of the Church. The World was published in 1664, 14 years after Descartes' death. From all of this, one might assume that Descartes was a devout believer. However, the opposite hypothesis that Descartes was essentially atheistic may be argued with greater plausibility than the first assumption. According to his hypothesis, Descartes was a pure naturalist, caught in a social situation where nonconformity meant prosecution and even death. He had no taste for martyrdom and consequently disguised those of his views which might get him into trouble, and embellished the remainder with a show of piety that must be understood quite literally as life insurance. Descartes' fate. Despite efforts to appease the Church, Descartes' books were placed in the Catholic Index of Forbidden Books, in the belief that they led to atheism. As a result, Descartes slowed his writings and instead communicated personally with small groups or individuals who sought his knowledge. One such individual was Queen Christina of Sweden, who in 1649 invited Descartes to be her philosopher in residence, and he accepted. Unfortunately, the Queen insisted on being tutored at 5 o'clock each morning, meaning that Descartes had to travel to the palace before sunrise during a Swedish winter. After only 6 months in Sweden, Descartes caught pneumonia and died on February 11, 1650. Descartes was buried in Sweden in a cemetery for distinguished foreigners, but there is more to this unfortunate story. 16 years later, his body was exhumed, and it had been decided with various friends and disciples that it would be more fitting for his bodily remains to rest in France. Perhaps they did not respect as seriously as he might have wished. Descartes' beliefs in the possibility of a disembodied spirit and the existence of mental processes in the absence of any brain. The French ambassador to Sweden took charge and first cut off Descartes' right forefinger as a personal souvenir. It was found that the special copper coffin provided for transporting the body was too short, so the neck was severed and the skull removed, to be shipped separately. The coffin returned safely to Paris, and Descartes' headless body was reburied with great pomp. The skull had a more sordid fate. It was stolen by an army captain, passed from one Swedish collector to another, and took 150 years to reach Paris, where it was awkwardly shelved in the Académie des Sciences, and has apparently remained there ever since. Yes, the man most associated with the mind-body problem, iconically, is a bit of one himself. Summary. Renaissance humanitarianism had 4 major themes: and belief in the potential of an individual, and insistence that a religion be more personal and less institutionalized, an intense interest in the classics, a negative attitude towards Aristotle's philosophy. The humanists did much to break the authority of the organized church and Aristotle's philosophy. This had to happen before the scientific attitude could develop. Although the Renaissance was a troubled time, it was a time of great curiosity and creativity. As the power of the Church deteriorated, inquiry became increasingly objective because findings no longer needed to fit Church dogma. Before Copernicus, the Ptolemaic system, which claimed that the Earth was a stationary center of the solar system and the universe, essentially the universally accepted, Copernicus demonstrated that the Earth was not the center of the solar system. Kepler found the paths of the planets were not circular but elliptical, and Galileo concluded that the universe was lawful, and the results of his experiments could be summarized mathematically. He also concluded that science and psychology was impossible because of the subjective nature of human thought. Newton viewed the universe as complex, lawful, noble machine that had been created and set in motion by God. Newton's science was highly theoretical and subtle and stressed deduction. Newton's success in explaining much of the physical universe in terms of a few basic laws had a profound influence on science, philosophy, and eventually psychology. In fact, Newton's science was so successful that people began to believe science had a potential to answer all questions. In a sense, science was becoming a new religion. Bacon wanted science to be completely untainted by past mistakes and therefore urged the scientific investigations be inductive. Bacon also wanted science to be aimed at the solution of human problems. He described 4 sources of error that can creep into scientific investigation: idol of caves, or biases resulting from personal experience; idol of the tribe, or biases resulting from human nature; idol of the marketplace, or biases to traditional meanings of words; and idol of the theater, or blind acceptance of authority and tradition. Like Bacon, Descartes wanted a method of inquiry that would yield knowledge that was beyond doubt. Descartes also decided that sensory information could be trusted because God had created our sensory apparatus and would not deceive us. Taking his inspiration from mechanical statues that he had observed, Descartes concluded that all animal behavior and much human behavior was mechanical. Descartes saw mind and body as separate but interacting. That is, the body can influence the mind and the mind can influence the body. Descartes' version of dualism is called interactionism. Descartes also believed that the mind contained several innate ideas. Descartes brought much attention to the mind-body relationship, caused great controversy over innate ideas, introspectively studied the phenomena of the mind, stimulated animal research and thus physiological and comparative psychology, and was the first to describe the reflex, the concept that was to become extremely important in psychology. And the philosophers and scientists of the 16th and 17th centuries reviewed in this chapter were transitional figures. Those thinkers are anti-religion, they were anti-dogma, and most of them believed that their work was revealing God's secrets. What made them different from those who had preceded them was their methods, which were motivated by apparent errors in previously accepted dogma.